thought since yesterday's video seemed relatively successful, I figured I would continue with this, and I might even get to the point where all the stuff that's rattling around in my head is much more manageable, and I can work on the things that I would like to do, the more long-term projects, because there are some ideas that I have that I want to produce in a nice way, and I enjoy learning more about how to make better videos, and I think that if you have something important to say, that you should do what you can to grab people's attention. Not that I am endorsing the Daily Wire level of slickness that has now been applied to the Jordan Peterson videos, but I think most people who watch Paul Vanderklay would say there's tons of great content in his videos. He has so much wisdom and good things to say about things, and being able to watch him in his thought process is a really fruitful thing for myself, and I think for other people, to kind of continue that thought process. And that's kind of, this sort of distributed cognition idea, where this little corner is kind of, ideas keep bouncing around different people at different channels, and they get more and more refined, and the ideas become more clear and better, and they improve, and that's, I think that's a really good thing. But it is a messy process. But, I think that there is something to the idea of trying to, when you have a thought and it's fairly well formed, you should, try to present it well. It's better than intentionally presenting it poorly. So that's all to say that there are several projects that I've been thinking about, videos I've been wanting to make, but some of them require a little bit more effort in like the filming, and for that reason I've put them off. But maybe I'll just share the idea now for the few who will see this, and then if I get to make a better video of it later, that will also be beneficial, and maybe I'll try to share it more on different places to get more people to see it. But so one idea that I've been thinking about for a long time is to make a video about tents, and I actually left a comment talking about this on one of Gavin Palmer's videos, Hero Looking for Group, and he was kind of talking about the idea of how do we like select our ideas, and I guess you can say this is like a big question, which touches on the thing I spoke about yesterday, is like, where do hypotheses come from? Who gets to choose the hypothesis? Because the scientific experimentation is a system. There are rules, there's procedures for how to do that, but what you decide to do your experiment about is kind of the most crucial thing. And there's a whole bunch of, for the one thing, people rarely publish, and therefore even less people read negative results. If you had a great idea and then you did an experiment and it didn't work, then that's, for you, that's a dead end as a person trying to complete an experiment. But for everybody else, that might be very useful, because on the one hand, it might save them time if they have the same idea from spending time doing it, or if they had the same idea in a slightly different fashion, they might see something that you overlooked in your premise in formulating your hypothesis that could be like the key crucial element that makes the difference between failure and success. And the problem is that the levels of filtering that have to, that an idea has to go through, and it has to be selected by the right people. Not everybody gets to decide what what we do experiments on. Some of these things require money and facilities and support and time and all these things. And so, for like the big scientific pursuits, you kind of have to be able to pitch an idea that's not necessarily just something you're passionate about, but it's got to be something that the people who have the money are passionate about, which is why, there's kind of a cronyism that goes along with that. There's all sorts of problems with how grants are distributed and how does something get to the top of the heap. And this was something that Nate Heil talked about in his kind of Welcome to the Grail Country channel. That he was talking about that he specifically did not want to only interact with people in academia, because a lot of times, they're in order to get to the point where you can really explore your ideas, you have to do so much work of, learning what's come before you in a specific manner, and, you basically end up with a whole pile of presuppositions that you can't question, and there's just this little itty bit of room where you can try to do something new. But there's so much of the foundation of that research that you really can't question. And maybe you can question some things, but just like you have to do it in a really circumspect way. This is something I really talked a lot about in my conversation with Dr. Von Mancha, and we had spoken a few other times off camera, and he posts a lot of things because he has this Facebook group where he's talking about epigenetics and how there's so much like it's so clear that there is this mechanism that works, and to the degree that it works, and what amount of control this sort of epigenetic system works is always in the research. It's always put within the confines of Darwinism and natural selection, because these things are like sacred cows in the biological community, and you can't question them. So, it really limits, because whatever you assume is obviously true is really going to shape where you can probe and question, and where you can possibly discover something new. This was something that Burn Power has a really great lecture with Hans Rookmaker, and he talks about this kind of what is reality thing. And he talks about kind of these these unquestionable assumptions that people have at certain points in history. And, whether they were people before them who held those beliefs or not, at a certain point, something just becomes common knowledge, and then it's very difficult to question. And, like he kind of talks about this guy who figured out that the heart was a pump. And, I don't remember what people thought of the heart before that, or, and anatomically, but, this idea that, this is a muscle that, it pulses in a rhythm, and that pumps blood throughout the body, and that's what it does. And, and he goes on to make these very important distinctions that it is a pump, but it's not just a pump, because, there is more to reality than materialism, but, without being able to question some of the other assumptions. And I think some of the other assumptions may have been, sort of rooted in religious or traditional philosophical, mythological concepts of what a heart is and what it's for and how it works. And, even the idea in general that when we say, like, the heart is like we know the heart is an organ in our body, but yet we use it to describe the seat of our emotions. And at various other times, people thought the bowels or the kidneys or, these other organs were responsible for emotions, or that different organs were responsible for different emotions, and things like that. And he gave another example of, talking about how everybody knows that you are heaviest right when you wake up because your body is full of sleep, and that sleep weighs you down and makes you heavy. And that once you've eaten and you have broken your fast and your body has energy, then you feel light, so you must be lighter then. And, of course, no one ever thought about weighing people before this, apparently. So some guy, made a scale that was able to hold a person and ran the experiment, and lo and behold, when you eat food, you actually weigh more than before you ate the food. And so you're actually lightest when you wake up because, it's before you've added to your body's mass. And so it's just stuff like that. So it's like nobody bothers to do the experiment because everybody knows this is the way it is. And, and he makes really good points in that direction. But what I was thinking about was this idea of tents. A tent in the Bible. And what I actually really want to do is, at some point, when I get the chance, to make a video of the yurt that I built. So I actually built about 5 years ago or so, I built a 10-foot yurt to go camping, my wife and I, before we had kids. We went camping at a national park in Maine, and it's actually, the yurt's been in storage at my parents' house for a while, and it's got some issues. I know because some of the parts were left outside and they kind of got exposed to the elements and had some damage. But I kind of want to see how much damage it has, how salvageable it is. Because the idea of a tent is that it is a temporary housing. Whereas institutions are like buildings, and a building is a permanent structure. And the interesting thing is how prevalent tents are in the Bible. And it starts with the descendant of Cain, who is the father of all those who herd flocks and dwell in tents. And then Noah is in a tent, Abraham is in a tent. Most of the people in Genesis are in tents, really, until, I guess there's kind of an assumption that in Egypt they have a more permanent dwelling, but not necessarily, because they were herders of sheep. And until they get to the Promised Land, everybody in the Bible is living in a tent. And the interesting thing is that in Exodus, God commands the Israelites to build the Tabernacle, which is a temple, but it's in a tent. It's a tent temple. And, that allows them to move it, because while they are constructing it and while they're in the wilderness learning the practice of running this temple and how it is used to operate as a means of worship towards God, they're moving about from place to place. And so a tent makes sense. But, it's very interesting, because in contrast to every other civilization in the world, like you look at the Tower of Babel, they wanted to build a tower and a city around it that would reach to the heavens, and God says, no, I don't want you to do that, and stops them from doing it. And, we can see, Egypt is where the Israelites were delivered from, and they are the most famous builders of permanent monuments. Now, they're not in their original splendor, but, these pyramids and temples and things like that still remain to this day. And this is true, of civilizations all over the world, that they all built these permanent structures. And, it's now just even striking me now that, it's interesting, because so many of them are this pyramid shape, which is the shape of a tent, in a way, but they are, unlike tents, they are very permanent, and they cannot move. And, so God endorses, at least in the beginning, this idea of a tent, because the tabernacle was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be temporary, and it was supposed to get them through the wilderness, and then into the Promised Land, and then, eventually, during Solomon's reign, the temple is built, and the temple is supposed to be permanent. Now, the temple is not permanent because Israel's devotion to God is not permanent. And so, when a symbol no longer, when a symbol speaks against its original function, which is to give glory to God, then it should be torn down. And that was not necessarily the choice of the people, but it was the choice of God, who brought the people who destroyed the temple, because it was no longer serving its purpose, because it was not working as a symbol to keep the people mindful of where their attention and devotion should be towards God. And they, went after these idols in these high places and things like that. So, but really the contrast is between a tent and some sort of a building. And the thing is that anytime you build a building, it's supposed to be permanent. But inevitably, there are going to be things that shorten the permanency of that building. Whether it's because of decay and the need for repairs, or because, it's outgrown its usefulness, or, like, if you think of a home, a lot of times, where I grew up in New England, and these places where there still are very old homes, a lot of times the homes would be built small in a sort of temporary fashion, and then additional buildings would be built around it as the family grew or as time permitted, and space materials were made available, things like that. But if you go to New England, you can live in a house that was built in the 1700s, like I did for quite a few years, and some parts of this house were remarkably well built because they used good material. They used solid boards to sheathe the outside of the house, and then on top of that, there was siding and things that were changed probably over the years. I don't think that, less likely that a lot of that stuff was original. And then on the inside, originally those old houses, they always had horsehair plaster walls. But most houses get renovated at some point, and that's removed and replaced with drywall. Because unless if you're, a museum, the effort to create horsehair plaster over wooden lath is so much more work and so much more of a tedious process than simply throwing up a 4x8 or 4x10 sheet of drywall. You cover all those square feet in about 5 minutes. So that's something you would notice. And then, of course, in the 1700s, they had no indoor plumbing. So there's going to be a plumbing system installed in most of these houses, which could date maybe to the early 20th century or the mid 20th century or something like that. Some of these houses are probably on their second or third iteration of plumbing, and many of them are similarly will have electrical put in, where if it was put in when electricity was the brand new thing, it's going to be a knob and tube system that's very unsafe, and a lot of times then that will get replaced. And a lot of times these things don't actually get replaced, they just put the new thing alongside of it, because maybe there's not really any point in tearing up old pipes or old wiring or things like that. So it's really interesting, because when you go into one of these houses, you can see all this artifacts of the various generations of people who lived there and what they did to improve or repair one of these houses. But at a certain point, and it may be a long time, it may be several hundred years, at a certain point, that house is not going to be functional as a house anymore. And there's a lot of problems with if things are done gradually over time as these sort of newer technologies are introduced, then it may be a worthwhile effort. If all your house is lacking is some better insulation, well, that's not the end of the world. But if you have a house where the siding needs to be replaced, and the insulation, and the plumbing, and the electrical, and the heating, and the cooling, and and the roofing, and the shingles, and and the interior needs to be fixed, and all this stuff. At a certain point, that house is not really worth saving. Or there could be any kind of catastrophe, a hurricane or a lightning storm or something can cause a house to then reach a point where repairing it is no longer wise or even feasible. And so, what does that mean you got to do? You kind of have to level the thing and start over. And that is to say, all structures are temporary to a certain extent. But a tent is designed to be temporary. And so that's why I was saying I have to see what state of repair my yurt is in to see how salvageable it is. And I know the roof covering was very temporary the one time we used it. We used it for about a week, so that was pretty good, and it worked okay. But I didn't really have a permanent roof. It was just made of tarp, that what we used for the time that we used it. And so, maybe that's worth repairing. Maybe it is worth repairing a tent. There are some reasons why you'd want to do that. But a tent is by design temporary. And what a tent really is useful for is it gives you a place to stay out of the elements while you work on constructing something more permanent. And so, it was actually interesting, I was just reading The Little House on the Prairie with my daughters, and they actually, kind of do this very thing. They have a wagon, and that's where they're living. They're kind of sleeping in the wagon. They set up their camp once they find their permanent location, and then they have to be working on the house. Well, until the house is finished, they need that place to stay. So the wagon is very similar to a tent. It's the same thing in a sense. It's a fabric stretched over a frame. So a wagon is a tent with wheels. And then while they're building the house, to do the roof correctly will take longer. So they actually just take the covering of the wagon and use that as a temporary roof. And, that kind of allows you to not be, what am I saying about this? We need more tents. And my initial thought was, when I was talking to, writing comments on Gavin's video, is that a tent is kind of like the way that maybe we have to think about like new structures, new ideas, new systems, new institutions. Maybe we just need to start building them really fast. And maybe some of them aren't that well designed. Some of them are not worth fixing. They're not worth keeping. Our idea didn't work. And then, fine, throw it away and get on the new one. But the problem is that we kind of fall in love with like ideas and institutions, and and I'm not saying that institutions are necessarily bad, but when they serve a purpose at their initial beginning, they work very well. And then as problems are encountered, people have to do stuff to kind of fix it or make it work or expand it. And that's good. But at a certain point, I think ideas and institutions and concepts and things also reach a point where it's either you have to accept the brokenness of it for what it is and deal with it, or throw it out and start over, or just abandon it, because there's a certain point at which it doesn't make sense to keep fixing the same thing over and over again. And I think this is some of what Jesus was speaking about when he talked about new wine in new wineskins, and we always want to kind of do the least possible to fix the thing that we have, and it's what's really hard for us is to figure out when do we just walk away from this situation. And so what I think we need to do is to stop trying to build buildings and maybe work on building some really good tents until we figure out, what's going on or how things are working or stuff like that. because a tent is also a very hopeful sign, because it's by design not to be permanent. So it doesn't mean you were born in a tent and you're going to live in a tent for the rest of your life, and your tent is always going to be in the same place, and it's just going to decay, and that's going to be the end of it. Well, that's not true. That's like all the opposite of what a tent actually represents. A tent represents that you're taking care of yourself, and you're giving yourself an opportunity to rest and a place to find shelter when you need to. But people who live in tents don't live indoors all the time. They sleep in the tent. They get changed in the tent. They go in the tent when it's raining. But the rest of the time, they're outside the tent, and they're working. And they are building things, and they are, tilling the fields and herding the animals and all these sorts of things. And so a tent is kind of a very hopeful thing, because it reflects a temporary nature in a optimistic way. That it's temporary by design, and so it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be everything. It's just got to work. It's just got to work enough. And this makes me think of this idea, and this is something that Paul Vanderklay has kind of talked about. And when he spoke about his response to Jordan Peterson's video about his critique of Christian churches, that we need to plant more churches. We just have to have more churches. And I think that there's been so much negativity towards like Protestant churches in general because of the fact of like, why is there so many different denominations? Why are they always like splitting up so many different ways? Well, they are, if we think of them as being tents, maybe that's, then the temporary nature, the local nature, is by design. And that's the thing. If you're building a tent, or if you're building like a log cabin or something temporary, you're not going to say, first we must import the proper materials from the other side of the world. Like, people when they settle on their land, they just use whatever they have at hand, And this is even like, that's, even to say, when they made the Tower of Babel, they used the things that were at hand. So that was one aspect in which they had a good pragmatic approach, because pragmatism is not bad in and of itself. It's very useful for a lot of things. And they, whereas you have these other, cultures and things where it's, we're building this temple, and it's in the Roman Empire, so we're going to scour the whole empire to find the greatest resources and all these things and the finest of everything, and gold, gold, gold. And that's actually, I think, a very interesting thing that is reflected in the construction of the tabernacle. That, there's a lot of materials that are used that are mundane, and various metals are used, various woods, and different fabrics, different animal skins, and things like that. And, God is the creator of all these things. And so he doesn't necessarily think of like, oh, when I made copper, I was inventing a worse form of gold. No, copper is different and unique, and it has some properties that are uniquely suited for certain things, and gold would be less well suited, or maybe even just in the abundance of it, like gold. One of the things about gold is that it's supposed to be rare, so you shouldn't use it for everything. And a lot of the instruments in the tabernacle are wood covered with gold. Now, I would say there's a good chance that was a common practice in a lot of cultures. But on the official documents, they would probably not say, just use wood and cover it with gold because it will look the same. Because that's you know, that's kind of like, whoa. Are we going to say that, our God is not worthy of having solid gold? So they probably, I think that's probably something a lot of people would lie about. I think most people do it just because of how rare gold is. But God says, yeah, do that, just cover it in gold. That does the same thing. And so the idea is there in the same way. You use what is at hand, and it's okay if it doesn't last forever. And I think in some circumstances that's like why, if local churches only last 70 years, that's not a bad thing. If a local congregation, is a flash in the pan and there's thousands of people that show up and then it goes away, well, that institution didn't last. And, I think about like Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill. That institution doesn't last, but lots of those people who encountered Jesus and became Christians through that ministry, just because that church fell, they didn't lose their faith. Of course, some people did, and that was all the people that, Christianity today wanted to focus on. But how many more of those people were in that place for that time and then went to a whole bunch of other local churches all across that city and state and other places, and they were able to bring some of what they gained and learned in that place and help enrich a new community. And even with like the denominations and stuff too, we get so upset about this thing of like, oh, there's so many splits, and even like, like, why is there so many Protestant denominations? That's so dysfunctional. And it's like, well, they're just all a bunch of tents, and their purpose is a temporary purpose in a sense. It is the same purpose for which the tabernacle was created, so that people could encounter God. And it being temporary or mobile or having many, many, many different variations is all really a useful thing in many regards. So I don't think that I think we need to reconsider the idea that like this is a bad part of Christianity, because clearly it's the way that it is, and it seems that it's the way that God has allowed things to be. And I think that's my in my opinion, I think the Protestant Reformation was a very good thing, because the Catholic Church had become an unwieldy institution that it didn't have the judgment to know what walls it needed to knock out, what needed to be torn out and replaced, and what could be fixed, what could be salvaged. And so somebody else had to kind of do it in a sense. And, there's a lot of messiness that comes along with that. And that's why I think that we also have to realize is that messiness is inevitable. The failures of these sort of systems are inevitable. And so, you can't stop it. But, the current system that we kind of have is that we all try to get together, think of the best idea for how to solve a problem, then we put all our eggs in that one basket, and if it doesn't work, we kind of lie about how much it doesn't work, and we, make excuses, and we blame other people for why it didn't work, and we don't even want to bring up, well, there was probably a bunch of other ways that we could do that, and you could probably take the medical response to the events of 2020, and that's a pretty good example of people trying to plug a bunch of holes in a leaky, bad system and a bad plan, a bad hypothesis. Um, so the messiness is inevitable. It's inevitable that until you start cutting down trees and trying to see what works and how you design a tent and how you build it, you're not going to get it perfect the right time. Now, if you know things based on other people's wisdom and experience, that's invaluable and that's very useful. But if you go into a new place and you're encountering new materials, new circumstances, new weather, then your requirements are going to be different, and your response to those requirements are going to be different. So it needs to change and adapt, and that does require some trial and error, which means some amount of failure. But at the end of the day, if your tent gets a hole in it, that's much less of a problem than if you build a beautiful stone, building and then find out that it was constructed over a sinkhole or, a fault line or something like that. Or if you put your tent in one spot and find out that, the rain runs down the hill and it's going underneath your tent, well, you can move to the other side of the valley and maybe figure out the spot where it's better to set up your tent. It's not perfect. It's not supposed to be perfect, but the amount of difficulty that you're dealing with is greatly reduced, and that's a benefit. And I think that going back to the idea of churches, I think that there is a symbolic kind of interesting thing to think about, the fact that Paul was a maker of tents. And, mostly that just gets talked about the fact that, he was a bivocational minister. And so it's okay for, you to work a day job and then have some sort of a ministry on the side, which, I guess that's what you could say I'm doing here. But I think that there is sort of an interesting concept to the idea that what his profession was a maker of tents. And he was a planter of churches. And so he very much understood, I think, that there is this sort of pragmatic, temporary, but useful nature in a tent. And it's not meant to be permanent because it points us, because this is not supposed to be the permanent thing. And so, I think that when our churches try to become the new heavens and the new earth, and it tries to become this symbolic representation of the permanence of the kingdom of God, that may be a useful thing for a certain time and place. But it's ultimately going to fail. And so maybe we should think about if the investment is better placed in a different way. And that's one way where I'd say maybe I think that the Protestant model works better in a lot of ways. In missionaries planting churches in other countries, they're just going in, they're giving people, they're not even building buildings at all. They're just giving people training, and they're making sure that they have a Bible in their own language, and they're training locals to be pastors and teachers and to learn how to study the Bible for themselves so that they can continue to learn on their own and then share that with their neighbors. And, the places where that has been the way, right now, those are the places where the church is growing far more rapidly than anywhere else. Africa, parts of Asia, parts of South America. When you're building a tent, you get people out of the rain a lot quicker. And if that's your goal, if your goal is to get people out of the rain, then a tent is kind of the perfect solution. So anyway, this has kind of been a little bit rambly, and I don't think that I've exhausted this kind of concept. I think it's a useful thing to think about. I'm going to continue thinking about it. And, I do want to make that video when I get my yurt set it up. So anyway, let me know what you think of this, and leave a comment, and hopefully you enjoy it. If this format is not unbearable, it will, at least for the time being, allow me to produce much more content than I have been able to for the past several weeks and months. So, thank you for listening.